Welcome to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. In this podcast, financial planner Peter Raskin helps families and business owners understand and prepare for their wealth journey. Along the way, thoughtful and detailed planning can provide clarity and confidence as clients confront a multitude of financial decisions. Listen in as Peter shares stories and insight into people's wealth journeys. Now, let's get into today's podcast.
Hello and welcome to Wealth is in the Details with Peter Raskin from Raskin Planning Group. Peter, how are you?
I'm great, Eric. How about yourself?
I'm excited. That's what I am. You and I were just chatting before the podcast. All sorts of things going on in both of our lives, good things, dramatic things, all the things that life, throws at us.
Call it life.
Yeah, right. But we're both doing well. So that's a good point to start at. And I know today we're going to be talking about how our personal biases can affect our financial decision making. And I love this. It's kind of like, just kind of a self-examination of what's going on. And I know that you've got a lot of great information for myself and the audience today.
Yeah, I hope this will be a helpful conversation. This is a great, a real interest to me. I love this part of the business that I'm in, and it just, as we start off the conversation, I'm reminded of a quote from Socrates, who said that to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom, and I think that's going to permeate our conversation today. That quote. So keep that in the back of your mind as we're chatting.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic quote.
Yeah, I think so. Just in today's world, we're just confronted with so many choices. It seems like every minute of the day. And in some ways, the world just seems so complicated, doesn't it? I mean, we're just bombarded with so much all day long on our phones, on our computers. We walk the street, the signs in the city are just, it's overwhelming. Driving around, I feel it's overwhelming, I think, with all the stuff that we have, whether it's all our news options, our entertainment options, our food options, clothing, lifestyle, work, travel, all these things that just we can choose from, which is great. It's great to have choice, but I think it's overwhelming. And I think we got to figure out how to deal with this on a regular basis. And one of the things that I've talked about in the past on our previous podcast, but I thought I'd mention it again. One way we cope with all this decision making is by using what's called heuristics. And I think you've heard a bit of it because we've talked about it in the past. But I thought I would read the definition of it because I think it's so important and it makes sense. So I got this right on, I Googled heuristics so I could read this today. And Investopedia.com tells us that a heuristic is a mental shortcut commonly used to simplify problems and avoid cognitive overload, which is what I think we all feel on a regular basis. And heuristics are part of how the human brain evolved and is wired, allowing individuals to quickly reach reasonable conclusions or solutions to complex problems. And here's the kicker, is these solutions may not be optimal ones, but are often sufficient given limited time frames and calculative capacity. So lots of words there, but basically it's a shortcut, a mental shortcut to help us make quick decisions.
And we need that today, right? I don't know. Have you ever seen Ready Player One, Peter, the movie Ready Player One?
I've not.
Okay, so it's a great movie. It's all based on virtual reality. And one of the guys, he's the bad guy. He says, because he's talking about all the players that have these virtual reality helmets on and their vision is in the game, right? He says, we estimate we can sell up to 80% of a user's vision without inducing seizures. And so he's talking about all these ads that will be around them every time they have their goggles on. And that's kind of how I feel right now. The things that you're talking about, it's overwhelming. And I think there are people out there going, we can fill the space and, with at least 80% before we induce seizures.
Right.
Great. Thank you.
That's
But
very funny.
Yeah, that's just what it brought me back to. But what it sounds like, you're suggesting that we may not always make the most optimal decisions when it comes to a lot of things in our life, especially financial planning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a financial planner, so that's the basis of our conversation today. Um, I'm saying that we're human beings, and we just may not always make those most optimal decisions because of these mental shortcuts that
Hmm.
are natural to us. And I think that's the key. We're not doing anything that we're not supposed to do. And I think the key to this conversation is just recognizing that we all have certain tendencies and biases. It doesn't make us bad or flawed. I think it's what makes us completely human, and these are human attributes. So I think it's so important to just recognize that we often are making decisions with these shortcuts, and it's just because of the shortcuts our decision making may not be quite optimal.
Yeah. Well, again, I want to go back to the quote, right? I mean, because Socrates is a pretty smart guy.
Yeah.
And I love it when you quote him because, again, this is not new. If you've been a long-time listener to this podcast, you've discussed this topic before, but it was a while back.
Yeah, it was back in, I looked it up, it's 2019, episode 8, and it's financial
Wow.
decision making isn't always rational. So
Yeah.
we've been down this path before.
Okay, so let's talk about, I really want to hear from your take what we can do to know ourselves a bit better so that we can avoid these mistakes.
Yeah, there are no guarantees that we're going to make perfect decisions. I can tell you that we probably won't. I'm going to try to give you some examples of tendencies that I see that have led to less than these optimal situations.
Okay.
I think that's a great teaching method are these examples.
All right. Well, I love examples, so let's do this.
Okay. So, we all experience tendencies on a regular basis. So here we go. And one of the first things I'll mention that we all suffer from this, or at least I know I do, my family does, and the vast majority of my clients do. It's called procrastination.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
It's a dirty word.
In some parts of our life, we don't procrastinate at all. We're just, I know that's same for myself. There's certain things I know I'm going to get done right away, and other things I kind of put off, and don't we all? And I just have an example of a situation that happened over the last couple years with a client, a family client, and this was a business owner who had a child in the business. The child in the business was also a client, but not as active a client as the parents were. Good little business. This child was taking over the business and was running it for years, for a long time. And we would meet once in a while, especially when I was meeting with his parents, and unfortunately, this fellow recently passed away, and he left a child. And what came to what was discovered is that he had no will, no trust. He had done no estate planning work. I was not involved in that aspect of his world. I wish I had been, but it's something that I had mentioned to him over the years, but nothing. I can't make people do things, and he did not. And that just left a lot of complexity and some results that were absolutely less than ideal, and it's sad. Now things are going to work out okay for his child that's surviving, but it's less than ideal for that child.
Yeah.
And it's just an example of how procrastination, how our just desire to kind of put things off can affect others around us. and they our our decisions to not take action, that's a decision, right?
Absolutely.
And it can have effects, sometimes negative. In this situation, it was. So procrastination is a big one.
Yeah. There's very few things I don't procrastinate on, Peter. I'll be honest. Getting a bowl of ice cream, I'm on it. That's it. I'm up out of the chair. I'm to the freezer, bowl, spoon, done. Got it.
Yeah, I get it.
But there's a lot of other things I do procrastinate on. So I get it. Do you have any other examples of in that scenario? Or are we moving on?
No, we're moving on.
Okay. All right. So what is the next thing that really is on your mind as far as what helps us control our behaviors or not control them?
Yeah. So I don't want to pick on you, Eric. You've already picked on yourself.
Go for it, Peter.
But let me ask you: Do you consider yourself a good driver? Maybe better than average?
I will say this: I am a great driver, and I'm definitely better than my wife.
Okay.
Don't tell her I said that. Well, but she would say the same, right?
So this is an example of overconfidence bias.
Oh, overconfidence bias. Okay.
Yes, there is a. This is basically a scientific term that describes a bias that many of us have and suffer with. So it's called overconfidence bias. And this is the example and this is a recent AAA study. 73% of Americans think they are above average drivers.
So 23% of people are wrong. Is that what you're saying?
Well, eight out of 10 men think they are better than average. So
3 of them are liars, is what you're saying. That's exactly what you're saying.
Men tend to be more overconfident about their driving habits.
Okay.
But here's the reality: is that 90% of accidents are caused by human error. So I love that example because we all suffer from it. I definitely do. I think I'm better than average. I'm probably closer to average. I don't know if I'm below or above, but anyway, that's the case.
I count it because I use my turn signals. If you use your turn signals, you've got to be slightly above average than most, right? Because there's a bunch of them that don't.
Oh, if I'm living in Massachusetts, if I use my turn signals, I'm in the 99th percentile.
There you go.
Anyway, it's overconfidence is something that many of us suffer from, and from a financial perspective, this comes out in ways that are not so pretty. So we work with a lot of our clients that have bought stocks and start businesses and are just certain that they can do it better than many. And some of them are successful doing it. But you've heard, the statistics about new businesses. Most new businesses don't succeed.
Yeah.
And actually, most individuals who are buying individual stocks are not successful at it. And what I find curious and interesting is that most business owners, small business owners especially, not large businesses, but small businesses, they tend not to hold themselves accountable. They don't measure results. That's most. Not many do, but I find that, and especially if they're managing their own stocks and bonds, they aren't really measuring their results, which is just curious. So how do they know even that they're better than average? And this recent decline in the stock market is an example where stocks that had done very, very well the previous bunch of years are getting hurt very badly, gotten hammered.
Yeah.
And that's where we need to be realistic about our successes and our abilities. That's really where overconfidence comes in. We want to be aware of our real strengths and weaknesses, our skills.
Yeah, something that stands out to me, Peter, in those two examples is that you may think for your entire lifetime that you're better than average as a driver. And there's nothing necessarily that's going to prove you wrong, right? I mean, you could go through your entire life without an accident or without causing an accident or not knowing that you caused an accident, right? And you may always think that you're above average. But when you look at what you just spoke about, starting a business, buying stocks, investing without having the knowledge, without, holding themselves accountable, all that, you find out very quickly, or you can find out very quickly, that you're not as good as you thought you were. And it can be extremely detrimental, right? I mean, that's something that shows you very quickly that you're not up to snuff.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's what your point is that it can be extremely detrimental. So Peter, what is the next thing on your list for us to be thinking about?
Yeah, this is something that we all do. I do it as well. And I try to resist doing it, but it's trying to predict the future.
Mm-hmm.
And based on logic, based on reasonable assumptions, sometimes that future just seems like you can look at it and say that's going to happen, absolutely going to happen. But more often than not, it doesn't. And one of the things we want to avoid is making large, important decisions based upon what we think is going to happen. Now, I'm painting using a brush here. That's not the case in every situation, but we want to avoid making predictions about what we think are going to happen. And the example I have here is a client that had done very well, sold his business, very successful, was single at the time, and we had suggested in our planning that he not make any big decisions right now from an estate planning perspective. Not do anything too complicated, because his life was still a little bit uncertain. And when I talk about, not making any big decisions, what I'm talking about here is avoiding making any large gifts or complicated estate structures. I just didn't, and I'd gotten to know him over 8 to 12 months, and I felt confident that was a good recommendation. Meanwhile, he had heard from his accountant that tax laws were going to change, and gifting limits were going to be reduced significantly. And it seemed like a rational thing to think that this could happen and was likely to happen. But he took that and ran with it and made some very important decisions relative to gifting that, in hindsight, he regretted. And I'm not saying that I was right because I didn't think taxes were going to go up or down or gifts were going to be limited. It's not about that. It's that I just didn't think he was ready. I didn't think he had all of his world in order to make that big decision, whether the tax laws changed or not. You always want to make sure you're happy with your decision, no matter what that future is going to bear.
Yeah.
And so he regretted that he'd entered into this complicated, not unwise gifting strategy, but it wasn't meeting his future goals and objectives. He got remarried, his world changed, and he basically is working out of that transfer now. And it was very expensive to do. So just an example of kind of really making sure that you're not putting too much weight on what you think will happen, because we really don't know.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Catherine Broy from the Raskin Planning Group. Apologies for the interruption. Thanks so much for listening to Wealth is in the Details. We hope you're enjoying it so far. If you have any questions or would like to talk more about this topic, please visit our website at www.raskinplanning.com. Look for the podcast's show notes and connect with us via social media.
Yeah, no, very true. All right, next thing on the list.
Okay. These kind of are tied together, and this is timely from a perspective of markets. Human beings really suffer from two important biases. Again, these are scientifically, proven, that we tend to focus on on our freshest and most recent memories. So one bias is called recency bias. And it's just the tendency to place too much emphasis on those experiences that are most we're not very far from.
Yeah.
Even if that experience is not the most relevant or reliable to help us make decisions going into the future. And so that's recency bias. And then the other bias, which is also really important to understand about ourselves, is it's called loss aversion. And you've heard me talk about this. The pain of loss is psychologically about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gain. So I'll say it again. The pain of loss is about twice as powerful as the pleasure of gain.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think that's so important, it's not just about losing or gaining returns in the stock market or gambling or anything like that. Really, to me, this is more about our world. We feel losses more powerfully than we feel pleasure. At least many of us do. You think about the loss of a loved one, a spouse, a child. That can stay with us for forever and ever, and it's so powerful and intense. But we often are not. When I say we, people sometimes aren't thinking about all the wonderful experiences they had with that spouse and that child that made us so happy. And so the pain of that loss is so powerful to us. So, and we try everything we can to avoid losses because of that sense. So when the stock market goes down in value, we feel terrible. We look at our statements and they're 10, 15, 20% less than what they were the previous quarter. That feels really, really terrible. Meanwhile, we forget that over the last 2, 3, 4 years, our portfolios have gone up dramatically.
Yeah. Well, I think that, and you can agree with me or disagree with me. I'd like to hear your point on it, but I think that thinking about a loss or, the pain of a loss is great if it makes you a little more cautious, but not if it makes you stand still or run backwards.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a good thing to learn some lessons, like don't touch the stove when it's hot. Maybe we're a little slower to move toward that stove in the future, which is great because then you're more cautious. But to never cook again, well, that's just silly.
Yeah. And I think that's the reason why human beings evolved this loss aversion.
Yeah.
Because it protected us.
Yeah. Run from the saber-tooth tiger.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so markets are down. People have a tendency to want to make a correction. They want to make a change. They want to become more conservative. They don't want to suffer any more losses because it's so painful. When in fact, it most likely is not in their best interest to sell at a loss.
Yeah.
Because eventually markets recover. Eventually. It may take time. It may take 1, 2, 3, 4 years. We don't know how long it's going to take. But a well-diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds is likely to recover in a period of time. And it's better to work through that loss and wait for rebounds. May not always be possible, but becoming more conservative when markets drop, and then moving back into the market when markets recover after the fact is just a recipe for disaster. It just is not helpful. And so loss aversion and recency bias come together, and it really drives a lot of our decision making around things like losses in the stock market.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we move on to the next item on your list, I do want to say, listener, if you have sold stocks at a loss, if you have sold things at a loss, tax loss harvesting. Peter's spoken about it before. He's got a podcast on it. I'm positive of that. I don't know what number it is, but go back and look at that, because even if you have done that, there's some things that maybe you can take out of that podcast, and then you can reach out to Peter and his team. All right, Peter, what's the next thing on your list?
Yeah, so this is another tendency that we have, and this is a little bit harder to recognize in ourselves, but it's so important. And what I'm calling this tendency is to focus on the wrong problem. Yeah. And don't we all do this?
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned being first in line for the ice cream sundae. So I'm reminded of kind of the wrong problem. You know, we're of that age where it's nearly impossible to exercise our way away from weight gain.
You had to remind me, didn't you?
I'm speaking for myself as well.
Okay.
we can't exercise enough at our age to burn up all those calories that sundae, that ice cream sundae. It's just not going to happen. We just can't do it. Now, when we're 20 and 25, we could make a pretty good effort and get a lot of that out of our system. but as time goes on, it's not about the exercise as much as it is about the calories.
Okay.
So many of us focus on the wrong problem. We say, well, I'll lose weight, I'll start exercising and keep our diet the same. And it doesn't really work. Another example, and this is kind of similar, a client also sold his business and did very, very well. This client did what many people do. Basically, he won the lottery, and he started spending. And spending. Then 2008 and 2009 came around. And if you remember what happened, that was the Great Recession.
Yeah.
A banking crisis. Markets dropped by close to 50%. And it was devastating. Well, this person didn't adjust their spending at all. They kept on spending. They didn't address the problem, which was markets were down, spending stayed the same. We got involved at that point, unhappy. Assets were, we adjusted the assets, but basically stayed in a similar allocation of stocks and bonds and risk, and focused on the problem, which was the spending. And to their credit, they began to make adjustments to that. And markets continued to do well for quite a while, recovered nicely, but still spent more than they should have to really bounce back to where they were. They had a large line of credit based on their equities, and we had recommended, as the markets continue to go back up, that they begin paying down that principal, and they didn't want to do that. And they still maintained the two homes. Their spending continued. Meanwhile, we had other market adjustments, ups and downs, and his focus was not as much on the spending. Didn't want to make any changes to lifestyle, but was more concerned about the investing, the investment management, the allocation. Wanted to take more risk so he get more return, so he could get himself out of this problem. And that's the example of focusing really on the wrong problem. Markets are going to do what they do. They're going to go up and down. It's totally out of our control. We can't determine how that's going to play out over a long period of time. Some years will be good. Some years will be terrible. But what we can control are the expenses. And so that's the example I use of focusing on the wrong problem.
Yeah. All right. I mean, that's a sad story. I mean, honestly, it's something that if somebody takes the time to truly sit down with somebody else and talk through that issue, maybe they'll see. Now, obviously, you did, right? I mean, that's part of your story. You did tell them, hey, these are some things you want to adjust, and they just chose not to.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just our own stubbornness that comes through a lot of times. But if we just take that moment to really weigh the differences, yeah, I don't know. That's hard.
It is. It's really hard. But
Yeah.
we're all humans, right? We have we can make our own decisions,
Yeah.
but we have to live with those, and there are consequences.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Peter, what is the next thing on your list?
So this is something I've done other podcasts about this, but lack of contingency planning is a tendency that some of us have. I've told some sad stories about decisions that may not have that were less than optimal, but here we have, that kind of decision, the ability to think about the risks in front of us, that life doesn't play out. I talked before about our tendency to a bias to try to predict future and how we're not good at it. Well, to me, contingency planning is not saying that this is going to happen, but contingency planning is saying, well, if that does happen, are we going to be okay? Have we resolved it? Have we talked about it? Are we willing to live with the consequences if that happens? So an example, certainly this is what insurance is all about. We want to make sure we have the proper amount of insurance, medical insurance, property and casualty insurance, life insurance, disability insurance, long-term care. We want to make sure we've addressed these contingencies with insurances if it's available, if it's cost effective, if it makes sense to us. So that's about dealing with those issues and coming up with some solutions to address those risks. But another way to think about this is also about our families. A lot of our families want to make gifts to kids and to grandchildren and even spouses of our kids. And one of the things that I think is important to think about as part of contingency planning is, what happens if our kids or our grandkids are in a difficult marriage and there's a divorce. Have you thought about what will happen to those assets that you've given away already? Will they be part of the marital estate? Will they be attachable by creditors, ex-spouses? So think about that. That's part of contingency planning. That's just another example, and I've seen that happen where families make gifts to kids, and those gifts are attachable by the kids' ex-spouses, and they sue for it, and that's a risk and a cost to the family. So lack of contingency planning is the next item on my list.
Again, walking through this with somebody, right? Talking to somebody about this. That's because we don't always know what the possibilities are, Peter, right? I mean, that's right. I'm trying to just say, hey, look, listen, audience, you need to contact Peter and his team. But realistically, you understand that I'm going to say that at the end of the podcast, because we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know what questions to ask a lot of times. So I love the fact that you're doing this. Hopefully it resonates with somebody and they say, hey, look, I do need to have at least somebody else to bounce some ideas off of that can give me these possible contingency issues so that we can make those plans.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. All right. What is the next thing?
Yeah. So the next thing is really for our younger client listeners is thinking about our biggest asset for a young person. And to me, for a young person in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s, is time and good health. You say that's an asset? Well, it is. So time and good health are really important. One of the things thinking about your health is that allows you to not only live a long time, but also to buy insurance that's low cost. Because if it's a health related kind of insurance, and here I'm thinking about life insurance, disability insurance, long-term care insurance, anything that you have to qualify from a health perspective, if you buy it when you're young, you lock it in.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got it at a discount. Not all of us stay as healthy forever. Matter of fact, as we age, the chances that something's going to impact the cost of these insurance products that we might want in the future is pretty dramatic. So think about your health as an asset class, as a way to buy something on discount. So good health also leads to longevity, long life, and using long life to your advantage, investing early so the dollars can compound over time. And that is so dramatic for young people to have assets sitting and compounding and growing for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, if not longer, is magical. It makes a huge difference to your retirement planning, education planning for kids. It gives you so many options. So use your good health and your longevity to your advantage. Our younger listeners.
Yeah, I agree 100%. If anybody doesn't think health is an asset, try shopping for a new knee.
Yeah.
You'll find out very quickly that's an asset. Good knees are an asset. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love that one. I hadn't even thought about that one.
Yep.
All right, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. What's next on your list?
So this is this is kind of along the same lines of what you're talking about with working with advisors to help ask questions that you may not even think about. So this is all about myself. So I want to give examples of kind of things that the tendency that I have, especially early on in my business. I didn't grow up wealthy. I grew up middle class in nice towns, but cautious and careful. I was some call me prudent and maybe cheap. I always worked for everything I had, and so a dollar was important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Delivering newspapers as a fourth grader, and mowing lawns in middle school, and working in restaurants, and working as a janitor in the summers, and all those things. I just did all those jobs, and so I worked for my money, and I was always very cautious about spending, which I think was appropriate and prudent. But when I became an adult and a professional, I needed to change kind of my thinking. I needed to think less about just the fact that I didn't want to spend the money, but that I should think about it as a tool to meet my objectives and goals. So in a lot of ways, sometimes spending is part of the solution. So for example, when I came into business back in 1984, I was, I thought I need a cell phone. Well, everyone's got a cell phone now. Back then, you had to install it in your car, and they were really expensive
Mm-hmm.
to make any calls. But I saw that I needed to do that. That would be a very cost-efficient way for me to grow my business if I'm going to be out on calls, driving around, seeing people. It was very efficient and a good use of time. So I was able to adjust and make that decision. But I always needed someone to kind of help me do that. I needed to work with coaches, mentors, to ask me the questions and to push me. And that was vital. That's been vital to my business growth, my personal growth. I've always felt that working with those that have done it before me is really, really helpful, because I'm not good at everything. I don't naturally know everything. And I've worked with those coaches and mentors that have helped me with that. And examples of when I didn't have that, it's cost me money. and this is more of a personal example, but we did a big remodel in our home years and years ago. And at the time, we talked about air conditioning. And I said, oh, we're not going to afford that. I don't want to spend it. We only need air conditioning 2 or 3 days a year. We can figure that out. Well, it was one of the biggest mistakes I made. And all I needed to do was work with someone who said, maybe you don't put in the air conditioning now, but vent your home for it. Put in all the piping now. Would it cost you a quarter of the cost, but do it while all the walls are open and the ceilings are down, because it was a big remodel. But no one told me that, and I didn't think about it. So an example of how advice can cost you. Not having advice can cost you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's kind of how I wanted to end this program, is just, hiring a comprehensive advisor keeps us honest. It's good protection from our own natural tendencies and biases. It really keeps us from making mistakes, because it's not always what you know, it's what you don't know. It's what you don't know to ask. Having someone that can ask you the hard questions can be insightful and help you make more appropriate decisions from a financial perspective.
Yeah. And I'm just going to wrap this up as far as what I'm hearing from you, what we've talked about on so many podcasts, is that hiring a comprehensive financial advisor, it keeps us honest, it keeps us accountable. I believe it's good protection from our natural tendencies and biases and idiotic behavior that I have a lot of times, and my assumptions and all these other things that creep into my life when I don't want them there. It helps me to stay on focus and on point to do the hard work that needs to be done. And it gives me an opportunity, or gives anybody who hires someone, you have somebody to ask the hard questions, and you have somebody to do what you just talked about with your air conditioning system. It will tell you things that you don't even know to ask questions about, right? This is the way to have more insight, and would help anybody make an appropriate decision, right? I mean, I'm assuming that you would agree with that.
I do 100%.
Yeah. And again, for those, if you're a new listener, understand that Peter's not selling himself here, and I'm not trying to sell you on Peter, although he's an amazing guy, and it'll be a fantastic relationship if you reach out to him. But get somebody in your corner that's going to ask those questions, the hard questions, and hold you accountable, because your future's worth it. Period. And that's I guess how I would end the podcast, Peter. Any final thoughts from you?
No, if people want to reach out, please go to our website, raskinplanning.com. Our contact information is there, and glad to chat.
Peter, I'm glad you're in my corner, my man. Thank you so much for including me on this podcast, allowing me to be here and listen and learn with the audience and ask my questions of you. You've always been an open book, so I appreciate that. And of course, our last thank you always goes to you, listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast with Peter Raskin. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Peter comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask that you share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this actually does help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Raskin Planning Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth is in the Details podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available.
The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Lincoln Financial Advisors Corp. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning. Peter Raskin is a registered representative of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Securities offered through Lincoln Financial Advisors Corp., a broker-dealer, member SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through SageMark Consulting, a division of Lincoln Financial Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Insurance offered through Lincoln affiliates and other fine companies. Raskin Planning Group is a marketing name for registered representatives of Lincoln Financial Advisors. Lincoln Financial Advisors Corporation and its representatives do not provide legal or tax advice. You may want to consult a legal or tax advisor regarding any legal or tax information as it relates to your personal circumstances.